In today's episode of Failed Cards and Mechanics, we'll be going over life point gain cards, explaining why they don't really see play, why they occasionally see competitive play, and also going over specific examples. When it comes to playing Yu-Gi-Oh!, being able to win the game is the #1 priority of your deck. In order to win the game, you want to either get your opponent's life points to 0, make your opponent lose every single card in their deck, either through a card effect or with just Victory Dragon, being able to win the game without ever having to do a game at all. So disregarding the Victory Dragon win condition, if your deck doesn't try to accomplish getting your opponent's life points to 0, mealing their deck, or winning through an alternative win condition, then your deck's not going to be successful. So while there are cards in the game which inflict damage to your opponent's life points, like Chain Strike and Magical Explosion, which are able to do so to great effect, there are also cards which allow you to gain life points, like Golden Ladybug or Supremacy Berry, which can't really be used to good effect. You see, the whole reason Chain Strike and Magical Explosion see play is because they can allow you to get your opponent's life points to 0, and you can build an entire deck around trying to get them to really high numbers of dealing damage. Chain Strike deals 400 damage times the chain link that the card is activated after. So if you're able to get a high chain link by just drawing a whole bunch of cards with stuff like Jar of Greed or Accumulated Fortune, while also activating other burn cards, you have a viable way in which this is trying to get your opponent's life points to 0 while maintaining card advantage. Magical Explosion allows you to deal 200 points of damage to your opponent for each spell card in your graveyard. So if you're able to get 15 spell cards in your graveyard and then use Life Equalizer, you can burn your opponent for 3,000 points of damage in order to reduce their life points to 0. However, if you activate Supremacy Berry in order to gain 2,000 life points, you're not really moving the game state towards being able to win with that. All you're doing is losing card advantage to gain a little bit more life points, and you only need 1 life point remaining in order to win. When Solemn Judgment first came out, it didn't really see widespread competitive play, even though it's one of the best trap cards ever released in the game, and is one of the few trap cards which continues to see competitive play in the modern era, where almost no one plays trap cards that you can't activate from your hand. And part of the reason it didn't see a lot of play at first was because it requires you to pay half your life points, which was thought of as just too harsh of a cost for only the effect of being able to negate pretty much one of anything your opponent happens to do, except a monster effect. Solemn Judgment can negate a spell, trap, or monster summon, which is so incredibly useful that all of those effects are good, and being able to get 1 key combo piece can win you the game. However, older Yu-Gi-Oh! Was more slower pace. Usually you'd win the duel by slowly attacking your opponent's life points over the course of a couple of turns, and being able to OTK your opponent was not common. Nowadays, if you can't OTK your opponent in 1 turn, then your deck is doing something wrong. So when you could actually survive over the course of a couple of turns, having to pay half your life points just to trade 1 for 1 seems like way too much of a cost for such a minor benefit when they had powerful cards in the game which could trade for way more. So it kinda makes sense why it rarely saw play, but it still did see play nonetheless, as life points were just seen as more a valuable resource back then. Even then, they still didn't really play life point gain cards, except for Emergency Provisions, which was played for other reasons. I will say though, alternative formats where people play in legacy eras absolutely play triple copies of Solemn Judgment. They take modern deck building and apply it to previous eras, and have way better decks than ever existed in those time periods, just because they have years to know that paying half your life points to stop one thing is actually super good. Even if your life points kind of are more important in those legacy formats. You see, the thing with your life points is that it should be used as a resource in order to help you defeat your opponent, and not something you really need to try and increase. There are very few instances where gaining life points are necessary in order to further the game state. There are a couple of archetypes where they have a gimmick to gain life points in order to accomplish things, like Aro Mages, but gaining life points is kind of necessary in order to activate their effects, and not really the whole point of that archetype. Let's take a look at Grenmaju for example. This was a meta deck which banished a whole bunch of cards really easily, which means they could make use of the card Soul Absorption. Soul Absorption allows you to gain 500 life points for each card that gets banished, and just resolving Pot of Desires would net you 5,000 life points with Soul Absorption. They could also banish 15 cards from their extra deck with Eater of Billions, and another 8 with Gizmek Orochi, so with just a single Soul Absorption, Grenmaju decks could easily gain over 20,000 life points by just doing their plays like normal. However, when Grenmaju was running around in the meta, no one played the card. It was probably one of the easiest ways to just gain a whole bunch of life points ever, way more than even Aro mages can do, and that's part of their whole gimmick. And it only saw play in 1 or 2 topping side decks as a niche option to play against Mystic Mine burn decks, because if you just gain 7,500 life points with an Eater of Millions banish, they can't really burn through that. Although it was never played in the main deck and wasn't even a popular side deck option against Mystic Mine burn in the decks that could play it. During the World Tournaments, they actually regularly banned Mystic Walk and Rainbow Life because of their availability to gain life points, and the potential for infinite loops. Mystic Walk allows you to tribute 1 monster to gain life points equal to its attack or defense. Since it's a quick play spell card, you can use it in response to your opponent trying to negate one of your monster's effects on the field in order to dodge that negate and let it go off. Or just use it during yours or your opponent's turn in order to win through time rules where whoever has the most life points wins. And Rainbow Life has a combo with Colossal Fighter that allows you to gain an infinite amount of life points. Although these cards don't really see play outside of World Tournaments, and them constantly being banned is more of a just-in-case procedure, rather than because of their actual problems. In Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Links, there have been a couple of times in which life point gain cards have been competitively viable. Back in the original version of the skill 3-star Demotion, you could use it once per turn in order to pay 2,000 life points to reduce the level of all monsters in your hand by 3, which meant you could normal summon level 7 monsters without a tribute. Now, skills in Duel Links add a dimension to the game that doesn't really exist in normal Yu-Gi-Oh! Because as long as you meet the requirements of that skill, you can use it whenever you want, without having to search for a card from your deck. And because you can always count on being able to use the skill, in order to make sure you could use it again on your next turn, since the starting life point value is only 4,000, was by playing life point gain cards like Supremacy Berry. Supremacy Berry allows you to gain 2,000 life points if your life points are lower than your opponent's, or else take 1,000 damage if your life points are higher than your opponent's. So the card would never really see play in the TCG because the only thing it does is gain you life points without being part of an archetype that can take advantage of its ability, and it doesn't gain enough life points, like Soul Absorption. Although this does allow you to activate 3-star Demotion again, so it absolutely saw all kinds of competitive play because the original version of that skill was one of the strongest in that game's history. Although that wasn't the only time pure life point gain cards were being played to great advantage in Duel Links. There's another skill called Extra Extra, which you could activate each time you lost 2,000 life points, where during your next draw phase, you would draw an additional copy of whatever card you just drew. And this skill was not once per duel, so it heavily incentivized constantly gaining life points, because you could directly turn each 2,000 points of damage into a +1 in card advantage. So Golden Ladybug was actually a key component of that deck, because it would cause you to gain 500 life points every turn, and you could sometimes make additional copies of it with the skill, which could result in you having 4 or more copies of Golden Ladybug in your hand, giving you 2,000 plus life points every turn. The deck would also make use of the field spell card, Temple of the Mind's Eye, so that you can never take more than 1,000 battle damage from any one attack, and the continuous spell card, Backup Squad, which could allow you to draw another card for every 1,000 points of battle damage you took. And the way you would win was by basically just milling out your opponent, with a copy or 2 of Hero Shadow Scout and Wormworm. The deck directly benefited from being able to gain life points, because you would gain advantage every time you lost 2,000. So it was in your best interest to just keep having more life points than your opponent could damage down, and you would just keep drawing into ways in order to stop your opponent from taking you out, thanks to stall cards. So this skill was eventually nerfed so that you could only use it once per duel, which was much more reasonable and completely stopped this life point gain deck. So it seems Duel Links had some success with pure life point gain decks, or just plain pure life point gain cards for their full purpose of gaining life points, because you could use those with skills in order to use those life points. This isn't really possible in normal Yu-Gi-Oh! If you want to stall out your opponent, it's much easier to just use something like Mystic Mine, or one of the plethora of stall cards available to the Final Countdown decks, where they don't even care about getting life points. Because getting life points in of itself doesn't advance the game state, unless you have some way to make use of those life points to advance the game state. That's better than everything else that can just do it already, which doesn't require you to pay life point gain cards. However, just like with extra decks and Duel Links, there is always the option of just gaining life points so that you can mill out your opponent. That could be seen as a win condition, just gain so much life points that your opponent can't possibly damage you enough before they run out of cards in their deck. And there's even cards which can help you accomplish this goal, like side effects, where your opponent gets to choose 1 to 3 cards to draw, and then you gain 2,000 life points for each card they choose to draw. So if your opponent draws 3 cards, then you gain 6,000 life points, which means your opponent's just that much closer to milling out their deck. You could even use cards like Graceful Tear, which allows you to gain 2,000 life points at the cost of giving 1 card in your hand to your opponent. So, if you give your opponent a copy of Pot of Desires, they'll be very tempted to play that card and mill 12 cards from their own deck, which is one of the largest mills you can accomplish with a 2-card combo. Although that relies on your opponent actually playing that Pot of Desires, and side effects is only useful if your opponent chooses to draw all 3 cards. So they're probably not the best examples in the world, but definitely cards that allow you to gain life points while also helping mill your opponent. It's a deck I experimented with in the past, which I would definitely never call competitive, but it definitely could steal games occasionally from meta decks on the online scene. The thing is though, even those 2 cards are not enough life points. It's too easy for your opponent to just deal more than 8,000 points of damage in 1 turn, and side effects actually gives you a lot of life points from 1 card at 6,000. If you wanted to play an actual competitive life point gain deck, where you're just trying to out-survive your opponent's damage, you would need a way to gain over 10,000 life points every turn without losing very much card advantage, which currently isn't viable. So I guess the video should be about how life point gain effects are too minuscule for the TCG, and they don't allow you to gain enough to be worth playing, outside of a whole bunch of edge cases, like Mystic Walk being used to win in time, or Soul Absorption being used as a niche side deck option against Mystic Mind Burn. So personally, I'd like to see more incredibly bombastic life point gain cards, so that it could be a legitimate thing you can try out. It would probably be terrible to play against, since you can't really play a life point gain deck without it being a control stall deck, but as shown with Extra, and even cards like Backup Squad, which basically allow you to convert high life point values into extra cards from your deck, or even Ancient Leaf, which allows you to draw 2 cards if you have more than 9,000 life points, there is cards which allow you to make use of high life points. They're just not good enough, and current life point gain cards don't outpace the amount of damage a meta deck is able to put on the board pretty easily. So unless an archetype directly allows you to gain life points as part of a gimmick, they're just not super useful effects to have, because they don't directly advance the game state, unless you're playing a deck that specifically uses high life point values to your advantage, which there aren't any competitive meta decks that do so, and the few in Duel Links which could were definitely nerfed because they were not intended to. Alright, so that's the video. Basically, life point gain cards don't allow you to gain enough to be useful. If you have ideas for future videos similar to this one, I'd love to hear about them down in the comments.